back, my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. We have got quite the jam-packed episode this week, so I don't want to waste too much time with introductions. But we got some follow-ups from WWDC. We got Bambu Drama Part 2 Electric Boogaloo. A rather surprising story of how an internet outage, or not necessarily an outage, but an instance where the internet did not work and it wasn't actually DNS's fault. Which is kind of brings to mind the Simpsons meme where it's like, sorry, force of habit, where the internet doesn't work and you're like, gosh darn it, DNS. And then DNS is like, what? And then you realize it actually wasn't DNS's fault and you're like, oh, sorry, force of habit. Because so often when you have an issue with just trying to access a website and it's not working, surprisingly, its DNS is a large fault. It's usually the one, not always, but it's at least in like enterprise environments anyway, it's almost always DNS's fault because of all the redundancies everywhere else. DNS is usually the one to blame for it, as seen by some of the large outages in the past few years, mostly because of DNS. But without any further ado, let's get this episode started off with our trivia question for the week. So NVIDIA is most widely known for their GPUs, and recently GPUs specifically catered towards AI and their AI dominance. But what year was NVIDIA founded? So what year was NVIDIA founded? And that is your trivia question for the week. So before we get into the cybersecurity tip, I did want to kind of touch on some follow-ups from WWDC, Apple in general, and just some thoughts that I had. But first, on the WWDC portion. So I cannot confirm nor deny that the YouTuber Luke Miani listens to the Dark Assassins podcast or not, but all I'm saying is 2 days after our last episode dropped, so the episode recapping WWDC, I made a comment on the fact that Apple didn't talk about the individual platforms like iOS, macOS, iPadOS, etc., and how they used to do that, but they have since kind of, over the past few years, it's like, yeah, it updates for this platform talking about iOS, but it really applies to everything, and I kind of made a comment about that, and 2 days after that episode went live, Luke drops a video talking about the exact same thing, where this was the first WWDC where Apple didn't talk about each individual OS platform. So, did he listen to my recap of WWDC and think, shoot, he's right? I can't confirm he did or not, and quite honestly, neither can you, unless you are Luke Miani listening. Only he can confirm that. So, Luke, if you are listening, it was fun hanging out with you and DOS Dude after your DOS Dude helped fix your Porsche, so if you ever want to collab, feel free to hit me up. But that kind of got me into thinking of another common critique of Apple, which is their operating system, software in general being locked down, and this whole idea of the walled garden. Now, I am going to try to be as objective as possible here, which I know is going to be difficult since I am a fan of Apple, but I am going to the best of my ability, give a pure software-based defense of Apple's locked down ecosystem and their walled garden. Now, one of the most common complaints that I hear about Apple and their products is, of course, the walled garden, or this idea that once you get into the Apple ecosystem, it is very hard, if not impossible, to leave. Now, of course, it's possible to leave. It's always possible to leave. It's just the conveniences and how beautifully everything works together makes it very inconvenient for you to switch platforms, whether that's to Windows or Android or what have you. Now, other criticisms that they get also related to the walled garden is how well their apps work with the operating systems in general compared to third party apps. So, Apple services and specifically Siri working so much better with Apple's integrated apps than with third party apps. Now, this easy cynical take here is Apple is intentionally making experiences for the third parties worse, to basically be the invisible hand forcing you to move towards using their apps and services rather than third parties. Now, it's no secret that Apple has full vertical control of their devices, from the silicon to the software. Apple controls everything. So, of course, their stuff is going to be very well integrated because they control literally the entire stack. The third party developers, on the other hand, only control the actual application that they're developing. They don't control any of the APIs. They don't control, the hardware, obviously. All they control is the code that's running in their app. Now, if you own the software and hardware stack, it's significantly easier to optimize your software to make your software perform significantly better on your platform than a third party. Now, it does go without saying that Apple does expose almost basically every API that Apple's using, other third parties will be able to use as well. But if you're inside of Apple, you know how to, potentially tweak APIs or what arguments to give an API that might give slightly better performance. And just these kind of little things that add up over the course of, the entire code base to make pretty significant differences in terms of speed, performance, and all that good stuff. So that is one thing. The other thing is all of Apple's apps are written in Swift, or maybe if there's old legacy ones, maybe Objective-C. But regardless, none of them are this progressive web app garbage that a lot of, modern cross-platform apps like to be. Essentially apps written in languages like JavaScript or Flutter that are then ported to iOS, which, let's be frank, they never perform nearly as well as a native iOS app written in Swift and Swift UI. The performance isn't there, the visuals aren't there. It's just a night and day difference, to be honest. So that's one issue. So if your third party app you're using isn't natively written in Swift, that is potentially one reason why it's not nearly as fast or integrated as the iOS version. Now, with that being said, the reason that a lot of third parties do this is for the ease of having an Android and iOS app in a single code base, and also a web app in a single code base. Now, as convenient as this is, convenience is one of those things where it almost certainly always has a trade-off. If it's in security, you trade convenience for privacy or security in general. If you make your password really easy to remember, it's probably not nearly as secure as if you made it significantly harder to remember. That's number one. And then the other thing, as we kind of touched on with optimization and performance, if you're making like an app that can be used widely across multiple operating systems and settings without having to change anything, you're going to take a performance hit because of the layers in between your code and the hardware that do the magic to make it work. Look at Java, for instance. Look at Python, for instance. Java is probably a better example because Java gets compiled into Java machine code, Java bytecode, which then gets interpreted by the Java virtual machine, which allows it to run on any platform. But if you compare the speed of a Java program to the speed of a Swift program or a C program or a Rust program or a Go program or literally any compiled compiled language, Java's going to get its butt beat. And then Python's just even worse because Python doesn't compile to anything. It's an interpreted language. So this is one reason why Apple apps could potentially be significantly better than your third-party apps because of the programming language that it was originally written in. The other elephant in the room is that when Apple launches new functionality, their apps will have those features at launch, meaning third parties are essentially playing catch up. So if you ever, especially when the betas first come out, so whenever you see like reviews on YouTube about the new Apple beta software and everyone, if people are whining and complaining that, yeah, it works well with Apple's apps, but it doesn't really work for third party apps. Well, yeah, no dip, Sherlock. The third parties haven't had a chance to update their apps yet to include all the new APIs and features that Apple just announced at WWDC, where Apple has already implemented those features in all of their apps. So, of course, this app third party app A over here that hasn't implemented any of the new features yet, of course it's not going to have the same, flashy integrations that Apple's built-in apps are going to have. That's just how software works. Now, sometimes Apple does make API updates that require no changes on the part of the software developers, but a lot of the new flashy features that they'll bring to light, like app intents, for instance, those require the third party developer to actually make code changes in order to make use of those features. So that is one, I think, elephant that sometimes people kind of overlook, especially when new releases, first come out. Now, one great example of this is Apple's new Siri features. So, for new Siri features, one of the reasons why it works so well with Apple's built-in apps is because obviously Apple owns the whole stack, right? But because they also have the time to implement it before it goes live, they have already implemented and integrated the specific frameworks and APIs to allow Siri to tap into the native first-party apps, which explains, why at the get-go Apple's apps work so well, like when they were demoing some of Siri's new features, why it works so well in those apps, but if you try to use it with a third-party app, it doesn't necessarily work as well. So please explain to me how it is Apple's fault that your third-party app of choice doesn't integrate very well with Siri when said third-party app of choice hasn't implemented the requisite frameworks and APIs to allow Siri to tap into the app and have all those fancy features. You can't exactly make the argument that Apple's gatekeeping their third parties when the third parties aren't even implementing the APIs and frameworks needed to be on the same level as Apple's apps. So that's one kind of big point here. So let's go through a couple of examples here because you might be kind of, throwing this away of, oh, you're just saying that, but that's not actually how it works. Yes, it kind of is actually how that works because I have dabbled a little bit in iOS development in my day. And for certain things like Face ID and Touch ID, for instance, you can implement the code to do that. But, well, first off, you have to implement the code to do that. You can't just have access to it. But the other thing is you have to set, I forget exactly the specific terminology that Apple uses, but for the sake of argument, there's like a feature flag or a permission or something in the actual Xcode project overview itself that you have to physically like turn on and enable in order to have Touch ID and Face ID actually work in your app. Because what happens is when you enable Touch ID or Face ID in your app, when the first time you open it and try to use it, iOS will give you a pop-up basically asking, do you give this app permission to use Face ID and or Touch ID? So that's one thing. So obviously, if your app hasn't gone through that process, of course, it's not going to be able to have Face ID or Touch ID in the app. That's not Apple's fault. That's the fault of the developer that created the app. So And it's the same thing with quick actions. Quick actions is another thing. So quick actions is the thing where like you hold down on the app. It used to be 3D Touch, RIP 3D Touch. You hold down on the app icon, and then the app can present a few potential options that you can do for quick actions. If it's an email client, like draft an email. If it's a timer, create a timer. If it's a reminders app, create a reminder, things like that, that you don't actually have to go into the app and navigate to a menu. You can just go through the quick actions and, make something there. Now, quick actions you don't get for free. You have to implement them, and then this was another thing where you kind of have to add a permission in the project overview itself in order for them to be enabled and for you to actually use them. So yes, Apple has a lot of quick actions on their default apps. So if your third party app of choice doesn't have that kind of functionality, again, that's not Apple's fault. That's the fault of the third party developer creating the app for not taking the time to actually implement that. Um, so again, same thing for like the calendar app, for instance. If you use a third-party calendar app, but you can't, long press on it to create an event, again, that's not Apple's fault. That's the fault of the developer. Another thing that Apple mentioned specifically in their keynote this year is how Siri will be able to take actions on your behalf on certain apps using app intents. So I bet you can't guess who is on the hook to implement those. Yes, it's not Apple. So if you create a third party app, Siri knows that it can do stuff in your app through app intents. That's how it's like in shortcuts, right? Where if you open up the shortcuts app, you can kind of customize your own custom commands using it. It uses app intents under the hood. So if your app doesn't have any app intents, there's really no way for Siri to tap into the app to perform actions on your behalf. So it's again not exactly Apple's fault that the third party developers haven't created any or many app intents that allow you to have the kind of functionality that Apple's built in apps do. Because if you look at some of the app intents on Apple's built in apps, I mean, it's basically anything that you can think of, there's an app intent for it. So that's one of the ways that Siri is able to hook into these apps and integrate with them so well, is because it has all these features that Apple has built into the apps themselves. So again, that's not Apple's fault that the third-party developers aren't doing this. So because the other thing too is, let's assume that Siri has the permission to do anything. App intents, throw them out the window, they don't matter. I can almost guarantee you that there would be some permission flag similar to quick actions or Face ID and Touch ID that you would have to enable to allow Siri to kind of get access into your app to kind of see what's going on. Because, for instance, one thing that you obviously don't want Siri to do is have access to your app if you have encrypted data stored in the app. So, for instance, if you have like a data store, which is something that you can have on iOS to like store, say user credentials or passwords or things like this, you obviously don't want that being exposed to anyone or anything. So Siri, I can almost guarantee you by default isn't scanning those kinds of apps and getting into them. But if you give it permission to, then it might be able to at least have access to some things in the app. So again, regardless, this is on the developer themselves to be granting Siri access to be able to tap into the app to be able to do things. Again, that's not on Apple for not giving Siri the permissions. So, the other notable thing that we should also point out is over the past few years, Apple has opened up for in a couple of different ways to third parties. One of the most notable ones, especially on iOS and iPadOS, is default apps. Now, it's fairly limited in the number of default apps that are allowed, but I don't think you can blame Apple for your third party web browser of choice not being listed as a default, or a messaging app not being listed as a default, if the third party developer hasn't gone through the processes to make it a default app. Because if you think about it, on a OS platform, if you don't somewhere state that your app is a messaging app that could be a default messaging app, or a web browser that could be a default web browser, how the heck is Apple supposed to know whether your app is a web browser or a calculator or a reminders app? There's really no way of knowing unless you define it like in the project overview. So again, this would be something that the developer would have to work on in order to enable the app to be a potential default in the first place. So again, not exactly Apple's fault per se that the third-party developer hasn't gone through the, requisite steps to allow their app to be selectable as a default. Now, whether this is a permission flag, whether this is a review process by Apple, maybe a combination of both. Either way, the third party developer has to put in some work in order to make that happen. So, again, not necessarily Apple's fault. Now, if it's a review process that you have to go through with Apple, then Apple has at least some level of fault there for your third party app of choice not being a default option. But again, they would have had to submit whatever paperwork or form or whatever they need to for Apple to even have the chance of reviewing it in the first place. So, again, this isn't necessarily to say that Apple is completely innocent in all their things and everything they do is, divinely inspired and all that. But the point is to kind of make you understand that the surface level critique of Apple and their software is missing a large portion of the picture. It's just that it's surface level. It's not digging deep into understanding why it is the way it is. Because again, it's like if you created an app with third-party plugin support. It's not your fault that the third-party plugin is a hunk of garbage that doesn't do what it advertised necessarily if the developer didn't implement it correctly. Now, of course, if there is actually an issue with the API that you expose to the third-party plugin, then of course that's on you. But if you offer plugins and the third party offers plugins using the same API, if your plugin is better than theirs, that's not exactly your fault, is it? So it's kind of the same thing with Apple software. Now, again, there is some things that Apple can't be completely innocent of, and you can't completely, just kind of brush away. But a lot of the big criticisms, it's not as black and white of Apple's intentionally doing this because they want you to use their apps instead of others. So just thought I wanted to bring that up. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are. So if you're on YouTube, leave a comment down below. Or if you're listening on podcast, you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Now, with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. This week's cybersecurity tip is to not use AI and large language models for your password authentication or your authentication system in general. Now, if that seems like a very stupid cybersecurity tip and nobody would actually do that, well, congratulations, you are in fact incorrect because one of the largest tech companies in the world, that being Zucky Poo's Meta, did just that and got busted for it. So I have a link in the show notes. Now, granted, this did happen a few weeks ago and it has since been patched, but it is absolutely hilarious that some threat actors were able to go to the Meta Assistant and basically tell it, hey, I'm trying to access this account. I'm trying to add a new email to this account. And they basically give it an email and then the AI is like, okay, cool. And then it's like, hey, by the way, I forgot my password. Can you help me reset it? And it's like, yeah, sure. I'll send a two-factor code to the email, the one you just added. And then you get the email, give it back to the Meta AI, and it's like, cool, what would you like your password to be? Give them the password, and then boom, the password has then been reset, and you have just taken over that account. Congratulations. The thing is, it was so bad because all the threat actor allegedly had to do was use a VPN to spoof the target's general location to not, trip the initial fraud detectors. and then basically ask the bot to add a new email address, then ask the chatbot to send a verification code to the email address, and then share the verification code back to the chatbot, and then ask the chatbot to show the reset password, and then reset the password, and bada bing, bada boom, you just took over an account. Thanks, AI. Congratulations. So I think this goes without saying that this is a really bad idea. I don't know who at Meta cooked up this as potentially being a good idea. Heck, maybe the code was vibe coded anyway, and no human is to blame. I don't know. But the fact that this was even a possibility is absolutely mind boggling. Like, this is like, honestly, this is even honestly, if you had a password on a website that had no AI assistant whatsoever and your password was password, your account would be more secure than an Instagram account with this meta AI behind it. Because at least with the password as password, you have to make the guess that the user's password is password. Whereas this, you just identify any account you want, you give it a new email, and then from there you're off to the races and you have taken over the account. Like, it really doesn't get any simpler than that. The only way it could be simpler is if somehow, some way, there was a script that you could just run the script by pressing the enter key, and it would perform all of these actions for you, interacting with the AI bot, and then just giving you the final username and login that you can go log into your newly taken over account. That's the only way that this attack could have been made any simpler. So you don't need to know anything about the account. You don't need to know anything about the user's email. You don't need to know their password. The only, I guess, thing you might potentially need to know is their generalized location, so you can spoof your location through a VPN tunnel to be around where they most likely are, just so you don't spoof any like potential fraud detection of, this account usually logs in from, say, Denver, Colorado, but now they're coming in from, Moscow, Russia. Something's probably up here. Let's prompt just to make sure they are who they say they are. So as long as you kind of know their general location, which, let's be honest, is not that hard to do on social media these days, through some OSINT or open source intelligence. Once you get that knocked down, everything else, it's just a cakewalk. Now, like I said, this has allegedly been fixed, so it theoretically shouldn't happen again. But again, the fact that this was able to happen at all in the first place is just absolutely mind blowing. So let's give a round of applause to the meta engineers over there, the boys really putting in the hard work, of allowing threat actors one of the most easy bypasses in the history of cybersecurity. So yeah, that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Don't use AI or large language models for your authentication system. Well, that is surely some music that we have not heard in a while. That's right, we have an open source highlight for this week. Now, speaking of AI, it is kind of around the same veins, which this week I wanted to highlight OpenCode for this week's open source highlight. So, it's essentially what OpenCode is an open source replacement for other AI coding tools like Claude Code. I've seen a few different articles comparing them to other competitors to OpenCode. Now, according to some of these articles, they claim that OpenCode is written in Go, at least the terminal user interface, or the TUI, through a framework called Bubble T. But I haven't been able to find anything to independently verify this, either on their website or on their GitHub. Their GitHub is basically all, like, I think, TypeScript, and the only mention of Go on their website is for like some model backend for like the AI. So I don't know how some of these reviewers were seeing that the terminal user interface was written in Go with bubble T. I'm not entirely sure. But what I can say is that the interface and kind of speed of launching open code versus say Claude code is significantly faster and very noticeable. At least I was doing the testing here on my M4 Pro Mac Mini, and open code was basically running circles around Claude code in terms of launching faster, running cooler, and just kind of general performance. I think open code was significantly better. It was a lot faster at not only, like I said, opening, but as well as processing and responding to my questions. Now, you do have to be kind of careful, though, using any one of these coding agents. Now, you can use Claude Code with open source tools like Olama, for instance, but you do have to be careful when using locally hosted models with Olama, because depending on what model you use, open code or Claude code for that matter might not actually be able to do anything. So if, for instance, if you ask it to say, hey, read this file and give me a summary about it, it will just give you what looks like should be the command to read the file, and then it just stops executing and doesn't actually read the file. Um, Took me a lot of troubleshooting to figure this out, but there's a couple different um, theories as to what is going on here. One of them is just don't use Olama, use something else like LM Studio was one of the suggestions. Another one was just use a different model. Now I tried several and a lot of them didn't work, but I did have some success with the Gwen 3 coder model. But the smaller Gwen 2.5 coder didn't work. So it might depend on what the model is, what it's tailored for, and how large it is, could potentially impact your performance. So if you are using open code or Claude code, of course I'm recommending open code here. If you use open code with Olama, that is just one thing to be mindful of and to check for, is if you're not being able to interact with being able to read files, write files, execute, commands, things like this. There's a chance, a good solid chance, that it's not actually open code's fault, it's the model you're using, so try a different one. Like I said, Gwen 3 coder worked pretty well for me. You do just have to make sure that Olama is actively active and running in the background. Otherwise, I kind of ran into the same issue where the open code would try to talk to the model to do something and it would just stop executing. But that was fairly easy to overcome, just, making sure that Olama was actually running, and then everything kind of seemed to work. Now, I don't know why this is, but OpenCode was not only pretty fast on my M4 Pro Mac Mini, but it was way faster than anything I tried with Claude Code. And Claude Code, without a doubt, in almost every single thing I asked it, took longer and also made the fans ramp up like crazy. Now, I don't know if that was like how I had like the thinking model set for Claude Code. I don't know if that was the issue or if it's just Claude Code in general, but OpenCode just was overall faster and quieter. Now, when I did ask it to do a larger task, it did, of course, ramp the fans up some. But for basic tasks, it didn't ramp them up at all, and it was very snappy in giving me answers, which I cannot say the same for Claude Code. Now, if the TUI, the terminal user interface, is actually written in Go, this would most likely explain the difference I was seeing, because Go obviously is a compiled language, so it's going to be running native machine code. There's no translation layers involved, which would explain why it launches faster and just in general is more responsive, because it doesn't have to go through any garbage JavaScript translation layers like Claude Code would have to do. But yeah, I don't know what it was, but when I was playing around with both of them, Claude Code just sounded like a jet engine constantly. It was like we went back to the pre-Apple Silicon days when everything was Intel and all the laptops and computers sounded like jet engines because they were always heating up so much. Um, Now, in addition to the fans ramping up, Claude Code seemed to force the Olama server to use significantly more memory than OpenCode did. Again, that might have been how I had things configured. But it was with the same model, so I don't know if it was like how I had like the effort level set in Cloud Code. Again, I don't know. But just kind of my general observations was Open Code seemed to be more efficient in almost every way in terms of responsiveness, launch times, resource utilization, all that good stuff. Um, and but like I said, running any of these, whether it was open code, especially if you're running like if you're doing a long query asking it to scan like a large code base or implementing some slightly larger task or things like this, it is going to cause the fans to ramp up. Um, and basically goes to pre-Apple Silicon days, where the computer is not very fast and very loud. Now, obviously, if you're using like a more powerful chip than the M4 Pro, you're probably going to see some slightly improved performance in those regards. But still, that is one of the costs that, of course, you have running models locally. Is you're in charge of all the processing for them. It's not happening in a data center somewhere. But again, the nice thing for that is, while it's slightly louder and might be a little bit slower, although honestly, I don't know if it was necessarily all that slower than say like running a cloud model, because you don't have any of the latency you have to deal with sending the request to the cloud, waiting for it to process and getting it back and, printing it to the screen. All of it's happening locally. So while the actual processing might be not be as fast, you don't have to have any of those sending and receiving latencies. Not to mention, all of the data that you send is all local. Nothing gets shipped to the cloud anywhere, so you don't have to worry about your data leaking or anything like that, which is fantastic. Um, but yeah, it's pretty neat. That one feature that if you like highlight text in open code, it will spit out. It'll automatically copy that to your clipboard, so you don't have to worry about copying and pasting things. Like, you can just highlight select and it'll auto copy it, which I thought was a pretty cool feature. So if you're interested in checking out open code, I'll have a link to the GitHub in the show notes below. And the next thing I wanted to talk about is the latest Bambu drama. Now, this, granted, happened a few weeks ago, and I can't take credit for having the most in-depth coverage of this, because Jeff Geerling came out with a video that did a very good job summarizing the issue, which I will have a link in the show notes below. It's pretty short. I think it's like 3 or 4 minutes, something like that. He does a really good job going into all of the underlying drama behind this. But the short version, or I guess not necessarily the short version, since his version's already pretty short, a Bambu is going after an indie developer that dared to fork Bambu's open source fork of a fork for their slicer, which allows you to send stuff to the 3D printer. So how 3D printers work, at least how Bambu 3D printers work, is you can't just take a 3D model and print it. You have to use what's called a slicer, which is able to convert the 3D model into instructions for the 3D printer to use in order to print the model properly. Now, Bambu Lab has their own slicer software, which is, I think, at least a fork of a fork, which essentially means there is the original slicer that some other project forked or copied, and then Bambu made a copy of that one. And then an indie developer made a copy of Bambu's. So all this is kind of like open source jargon for Bambu copied someone else's copy of something, and the indie developer copied the copy that Bambu copied. So basically, they blamed the dev for impacting their cloud infrastructure, even though the code to communicate with Bambu's cloud is exactly the same as what it was in Bambu's repo. He didn't touch it, which, that's what happens when you fork something. You have a direct copy of their code. So he changed other aspects of the code, but not the part of the code that communicates with Bambu's cloud infrastructure, which is what they were claiming that he was impacting somehow. Uh, so everyone was rightfully up in arms over this. The whole open source licensing and everything. Now, there's no. Now, what they were saying was there's no actual legal ground here for Bamboo to take. Now, I'm no lawyer, obviously. I am a software engineer. I'm a code monkey who occasionally breaks stuff in his home lab. So I can't say for certain whether there's actual legal standing or not. But but generally speaking, from my um, caveman knowledge of the law, if you have an open source project with an open source license, if someone copies that code and makes their own changes for it, it's basically fair game. Now there are of course some stipulations depending on the license where this can kind of get hairy, but the main kind of points of open source licenses is either you can do whatever the heck you want with it, or you can do whatever the heck you want with it as long as you also make your product open source. Those are some of the two more common ones. Now, I don't know exactly what Bamboo license they chose, so whether there's actual legal standing here or not. Um, but again, I think the fact that Bamboo is going after this indie dev for forking their software is kind of dumb. So I support the backlash in that regard. Um, but I've said this before about Bamboo Lab printers, and I'll say it again. Here is my hot take on this. I could honestly care less that Bamboo is trying to force everyone who uses their printers and their slicer software, well, I guess more specifically their printers, to send everything to the cloud. I could honestly care less because the fact of the matter is maybe it's just my Bamboo printer is old. I don't know. But at least on my Bamboo printer, which is the P1S, I believe, I have never updated the firmware on it. It is completely isolated. It's not connected to any network, nor has it ever been, nor will it ever be. And I can print whatever the heck I want, whenever the heck I want, and I don't have to worry about any of my prints going to the cloud. Why? Because I do it the old school way, put my prints on an SD card, put the SD card in the printer, select the print I want, and print it. Now, is that less convenient than going into the slicer and saying print to my printer? Yes, it absolutely is. But again, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, that's what happens when you trade convenience for security. You trade the convenience of being able to print from wherever, whenever you want, with the security of all of your prints are now going through Bamboo's cloud. Now, there are ways around this, which Jeff Geerling talked about in his video, where you kind of have it on a isolated network and you use a modified version of the slicer software in order to not actually have to go through the cloud. So there are some kind of very funky workarounds in a way that only the open source community could come up with. But at the end of the day, some people are up in arms over the fact that Bamboo printers are trying to send all of your prints through their cloud regardless of whether it actually needs to or not, which, while I agree that that is horrible and it shouldn't happen, I honestly could care less because how easy it is to not have that happen. At least in my case. Now, I don't know if on newer Bamboo printers, if there is no more option to print via an SD card, if that is in fact the case, that you can't just pop in an SD card with the prints you want and print them without any connectivity to any network whatsoever, then my rage is increased towards Bamboo. But at least with the 3D printer I have from Bamboo and my experience with them, that is not the case. And from the get go, when I bought this 3D printer, I had no intentions of ever connecting it to the internet. Because, like any IoT garbage, it's almost always going to be trying to phone home, whether that is whenever you try to print something to it or just kind of in general relaying telemetry or whatever information back to its home. Now, of course, you can obviously circumvent this by putting it on an isolated VLAN network so it can't actually talk out, but you can talk to it. That is obviously a possibility. But again, it seems like there potentially could be some funkiness going on I don't know if it's like a firmware thing or if it's a Bambu slicer thing, where if it's connected to the internet and trying to print through the internet, it has to go to the cloud first, then to your printer. Unless you do like the workarounds that kind of Jeff talked about. But now, if you're wondering, well, you never updated the firmware on your printer, aren't you just asking for it to be hacked? And yes, but no, because the printer is one, only on when I'm printing something, otherwise it is powered off. And two, it is never connected to any network whatsoever. I don't even think Ethernet's an option, but there is no Wi Fi connection to it whatsoever. So there is no way for it to connect to anything for anyone to talk to it. Now, theoretically, I suppose, if there was some bug in like the Wi-Fi searching feature, and if it's not connected to the Wi-Fi on the firmware level, it'll be constantly trying to beacon for a Wi-Fi signal, and you could somehow spoof and hack into it through that request and then get access to the printer. But what are you gonna do? It's not connected to anything. It can't do anything. The worst thing you can do is potentially interrupt my print, which I would be annoyed at, but I could just reprint it. So there's, from my perspective, the risk, if any, is almost zero. And I could honestly care less because it does everything I need to. I just put in my SD card and I print whatever I want to print. So again, I know that's kind of a hot take that I don't care that Bamboo is trying to send everything to the cloud, but that's mainly because, at least in my use case, it is trivial to not have to deal with that at all. Now, if I was forced to do that and I had no other choice but to do that, then yes, I would be pretty upset about it. But you don't have to do it. If that's your whole shtick, that I'm mad because when I try to print stuff over the network, it's going to Bambu's cloud and everything. Do you know how cheap it is to get either an SD card, a micro SD card, and or micro SD card adapter so you can just do all your printing 100% locally? It's pretty easy and it's pretty cheap. So yeah, if you're in that camp and you have a Bamboo printer and it has a micro SD card that you can print from, I would just recommend disconnecting it from any network and just using the micro SD card to print everything. That that would be my recommendation. That's what I do. But again, the privacy concerns still remain. I'm not trying to discredit that at all. The fact that any print goes through their network is kind of despicable. Just like if you have an IoT device to like manage your lights or anything, if it has to go through the cloud to get to your smart device, even if everything otherwise could be done completely locally, that is just without a doubt stupid. But at least in this case, like I already beat the horse to death at this point. It's really easy to not have to worry about it at all. So, yeah. So with that, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. Now, this took over a year, but I finally made another update to my Server Connect program, which allows making moving machines significantly easier. So, one thing that I'd been wanting to do for a while is add a flag that allows you to automatically accept the SSH fingerprints of new devices that you haven't connected to before. Because one of the most annoying things if you're trying to like connect to a lot of devices at once, like if you're using Ansible playbooks, for instance, is if you've never connected to the device before, it will always ask you, do you want to accept like the SSH fingerprint? Now, there's of course ways that you can just like auto accept this and bypass it, but you have to know what the command is, which, let's be real, most times when people are just connecting to like through SSH, they're just doing SSH and either username at IP address or domain, or just SSH name of whatever the connection is in their SSH config file. So most people aren't actually writing out the whole laundry list of command needed to auto accept the SSH fingerprints. So what I did was the tool can now auto accept every single connection that you have in your connections file. It can automatically do all that for you. It can do individual ones. And anytime you add or update a connection that changes either the username or, well, I guess not the username, anytime it changes the IP address and the domain and or the domain name, it will prompt you if you want to auto accept the SSH fingerprint. So for instance, if you wanted to keep the same name of a connection but wanted to update it to point to a new host, since you say you spun up a new one or you deprecated the old one and now you're going to a different host, you can now do that, auto accept the fingerprint, and you'll be off and running. So the next time you log in, you don't have to worry about accepting the fingerprint. So definitely well overdue, and this is something that will, especially for my use cases, be very beneficial. Like whenever I, make or get a new device and and I download all my config files, my SSH connect my server connect config file is in there. So whenever I want to connect to a device, it's like, oh yeah, I got to accept the fingerprints here. So I could just, run one command with the flag, and it'll go through every single one of the connections and auto accept all the fingerprints, so I don't have to worry about doing it, which is very nice change. This was something that I kind of had wanted to implement for a while now. I just never really had the time, honestly forgot about it, but finally got it around to it this week. And I also realized there was a very embarrassing bug where if you would try to run one of the flags with the update partial, so like update partial, like the IP address or the username or the name of the connection, that kind of a thing, it just wouldn't work. And it was really dumb because the argument it was taking in was called connection, but then later in the code it was referenced as connections. So obviously, if the variable is connection, but it's trying to call connections, it's not going to work. So pretty embarrassing bug on my part, but that has obviously since been fixed. So yeah, some good updates there for the Server Connect program. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is the time where it wasn't actually DNS's fault. And this is a story where DHCP, which is the way that you can connect to a Wi-Fi network or Ethernet network or just network in general, and you magically get an IP address assigned to your device without actually having to do anything. That is what DHCP is. It what automatically assigns IP addresses to all the various clients. So DHCP is great when it actually works. And there are instances where it doesn't work very well. And now, granted, these are edge cases. And in the majority of use cases, like say in your home, I would reckon that that there's like a 99% chance that you're never going to run into an issue with DHCP. The only potential reason why you might is if you are a home labber, then you might run into this issue. So the story behind this is I was helping a friend with doing a post mortem on why their internet didn't work, and the high level was that when they connected their laptop to a network, their laptop got an IP address, but once they tried to connect to like the internet and like, do anything, it didn't work, even though they had a valid IP address. So hours of troubleshooting later, it was finally decided that the IP address was probably an issue, so they manually assigned a different IP address to the laptop, and magically everything started working. So, what happened here? As I kind of already spoiled it for you, it was DHCP. It was not DNS. So, DNS, you can go sit this one out. You can take a well-deserved break. We're not going to roast you this time. So it was a DHCP conflict, and I've actually seen this before, and it's actually happened to me before. And essentially, what a DHCP conflict is it's kind of like a race condition where usually it's fine. It's probably not going to crop up, but when it does, it's usually out of nowhere. It's really hard to troubleshoot and figure out what's causing it. And then you'll try the exact same thing later and it works without issue. So DHCP conflicts are similar to race conditions in that sense, and what essentially happened here and what happens in these kinds of situations is that if a single device sets a static IP address for itself within the range of the DHCP server, there is a chance that the DHCP server will look through its allocated IP addresses, see that this IP address is not in use, and assign it to a new client. But if a other device on the network has already manually set that IP address to be their IP address, then you're going to have a conflict of IP addresses. And because that other device already has it and is using it, your device isn't going to be able to do anything. Now, I found out about this one time because I set my DHCP range, I think, to like 1 to 100. And I had a device specifically assigned with a static IP at 100, and I just so happened that my phone connected with the 100 IP address and I couldn't do anything. So then I was like, "Oh yeah, uh DHCP ranges actually matter." So guess what? I changed the DHCP range to not include any static IP addresses at all, and wouldn't you know it, haven't had an issue since. Imagine that. So yeah, essentially like I said, what's going on here is there's a disconnect between what the DHCP server thinks is available versus what's actually available. Now, the reason why in these cases you can't just disconnect and reconnect is because DHCP servers lease out IP addresses. So what that means is when you are a new device connecting to the DHCP server, the DHCP server will check your MAC address and be like, "Do I have an entry for this already in my leased IP addresses?" If I do, I just give them that IP address back and everything's good. If I don't have them, I will then check to see what the next available IP address I can give them, assign it to that MAC address, and give them that IP address. So typically, these leases last from honestly, it depends on the environment. If you're on like a home network, something like a week is probably pretty typical. Other cases could be like maybe 24 hours. If you're on like a corporate network, maybe you want something less than that, maybe like 8 hours. So just disconnecting and reconnecting won't give you a new IP address because the lease hasn't come up yet. So every time you try to reconnect, you're just going to get the same IP address until that lease expires. So that's why you can't just disconnect and reconnect. You can't just turn your Wi-Fi off and back on again, because if you've already been leased an IP address, you're just going to get that one again. So this is why sometimes this can be kind of an annoying issue, because it's not like other issues where you can just like restart the app or turn it off and turn it back on again. It doesn't work that way. But again, this if you're only using DHCP and there's no static IP addresses in play, this isn't going to be an issue because the DHCP server is able to have an accurate table of every single device that has an IP address and what it is, so it won't give you a duplicate. Um, so, like I kind of touched on, um, there's a couple ways that you can kind of get around this, because again, the root cause is there's a static IP address set, but the DHCP server isn't aware of it. So the few fixes are only use static IP addresses. This is a terrible idea because this is a royal pain in the butt, because that is literally the entire point of DHCP, what it was designed to do, so you don't have to manually assign IP addresses to every single new device that joins your network. Because let's be honest, if you have a ton of devices, you might forget which IP addresses you've already assigned, and you might run into this exact same issue. Now, if you're like a home labber and you're a very diligent and dedicated and to documenting everything, you probably have every IP address that you've ever assigned documented somewhere. So for you, it probably won't be an issue. But for your average Joe, it will become more of an issue. Although I suppose they probably wouldn't have as many devices, so the likelihood of them running into the same IP address is probably a little bit lower. Um, The other solution is don't set any static IP addresses at all. Now, this is what I would honestly recommend to 99% of the people. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably fall into that 1% that I would not recommend it for, because if you run anything in like a home lab situation, or you have any services that you rely on for things, DHCP is not a viable solution, because while typically, if your device is always connected to the network, it's almost always going to keep the same IP address even when the DHCP lease expires, but you're not guaranteed that. And if you ever run into, say, like a power outage, the chance that you get the same IP address when power comes back on is significantly less likely. Now, if you have a static IP address, you don't have to worry about this. The IP address never changes. So if you have like bookmarks, or you have DNS records, oh, DNS, you're coming back. If you have DNS records that point to specific IP addresses, if you're set up with DHCP, all of those are going to get messed up and you're going to be in for a bad time. So if you have dedicated services running at your house, static IPs are basically a must. But if you aren't running any services like that, there is absolutely no reason to have any static IP addresses. Now, your router slash modem slash Wi-Fi access point will most likely have a static IP address like configured from the factory, um, and that's worth keeping. But aside from that, yeah, I don't see any reason, unless you have a specific use case where you need an IP address never to change, that you shouldn't just always default using DHCP, because it you don't run into conflicts that way. Um, but the best solution is kind of a hybrid approach of the two, which I kind of already alluded to, which is you don't set any static IPs in the range of your DHCP server. Now, this does maybe take some advanced maneuvering, uh, some advanced network administration. You basically can get your CCNA if you're able to do this. Just kidding. Um, if you go into the admin portal for your whatever is leasing out your DHCP services, which is most likely your access point that your or slash router slash modem all in one combo thingy, whatever that your ISP gave you. If you go into there, there is a setting for DHCP, and you can manually select what you want the range to be. I think the typical range is like 192.168.1.1 to like, well, actually, no, probably 1.2 to like, dot 254 or something like that. So basically the entire slash 24 network. And most likely you probably won't have issues, but if you do want to set static IP addresses in that same, subnet, what I would do is just maybe reserve the last like 100 addresses, or 150 or 20, or however many you need to be static IP addresses like at the end, and then just have everything kind of in the beginning and up to that be DHCP range. So like for me, for instance, my subnet is goes up to like 100, and then all of anything from below 100 is basically DHCPable, and then everything above that, it DHCP doesn't touch at all, which is where I have all of my static IP addresses in that subnet set. I have other networks, obviously, but within that subnet where DHCP lives, the top half of it is reserved specifically for static IPs that I manage myself, and then everything below 100, not including 100, is just kept for DHCP. So that way, don't have to worry about any instances of IP addresses clashing. So yeah, definitely a interesting case study. If you've never had it happen to you before, where your internet doesn't work, DNS is obviously a go-to. Checking to see like a ping to see if you can access the internet's another one. And then checking what IP address you actually have, and making sure that there aren't any other IP addresses on the network with the same one. That is a pretty good test. Now, again, one thing you could do is, if you are suspicious that you might have a duplicate IP situation going on, One thing that you can do is on almost every operating system, it's going to vary depending on the OS. You can update your network settings to manually set a static IP address locally. So you can kind of play around with that a little bit to see if changing that manually gives you a different IP address. And if it does, then you know that you, in fact, do have an IP conflict. So that was an interesting case study, I guess, if you will, that I wanted to bring up to wrap up this episode. But before we go, we have to get back to our trivia question for the week, which is NVIDIA is most widely known for their GPUs and recently AI dominance. But what year was NVIDIA founded? If you said 1993, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And if you enjoyed this episode, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Be sure to share it with a friend or family member. We covered a lot of ground here, so chances are that someone's going to be able to learn something from this episode. And if you have any questions, comments, ideas, or topics for future episodes, be sure to shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or if you're on YouTube, you can just leave a comment down below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.